Isn't it long past time that the religious just gave up on Pascal's wager? I guess so long as idiot theists keep falling for it, it's never going to go away completely, but it just proves how dumb religion actually is. This might be a new take, though, so let's go take a look. It might be nice to find something new and original, but don't get your hopes up, okay? This time, we've got a request by PitchBlack0000, a testify video on Pascal's wager. It's called Atheists, Forget Pascal's Wager, Here's the Real Challenge. Great, I'm certainly up for a challenge, even though testify is universally stupid and unchallenging, at least in my experience. I'm generally willing to give it a shot, though, so go ahead, Eric. Show us what you got.
Christian apologists, let's be real. Pascal's wager is famous, but it's got some major flaws.
You know, like being entirely irrational and only complete imbeciles believe it. Stuff like that. Because that's really the problem with Pascal's wager. The people who push it, they don't understand reality, not like they care. They've never thought about it intelligently because it's another one of those silly religious gotchas that they think that anyone outside of their religious cult is going to fall for, but we never ever do. Because we think and they just believe. And that's kind of pathetic, isn't it?
The pitch is simple. If God exists and you believe, you win heaven. If God exists and you don't believe, you lose big time.
But that's only because you can't understand that the choice isn't your God or no gods at all. I think other religions would beg to differ. But of course, they can't think about that because these people and thinking, they are not on a first-name basis. Once we throw out the ridiculous false dichotomy, things get a whole lot more difficult, and the religious just fall apart. That's why most of the big-name apologists, they don't even try Pascal's wager anymore, and even most of the clueless YouTube variety, they're getting sick of being kicked in the teeth when they do. So, good idea, let's just completely forget Pascal's wager. It was a complete waste of everybody's time. Got anything better? I certainly hope so, but extensive experience tells me that it's just going to be more shit incoming. But let's be charitable and see.
God doesn't exist, you lose nothing in comparison to gaining eternity, so it's smart to bet on God.
He's still at it, isn't he? But what if the God that actually exists is going to punish anyone who believes in the opposition, but not someone who doesn't believe in any gods at all? We can play a lot of these what-if games, right? But here's one that they refuse to acknowledge. What if there are no gods and you waste the only life that you actually get believing in this complete nonsense? Giving your money to a church that just squanders it. Spending your time on your knees talking to yourself. You've only got a finite amount of time here. Do you really want to waste it believing in complete bullshit? Not if you have a brain in your head. I've pointed this out to Christians too, and the response is almost always, well, it's my life, I can do what I want, or some variation on that. Okay, sure, go ahead. I just find that utterly pathetic, but go right ahead. It is your life, knock yourself out. And I'll just laugh at your stupidity and get back to living in the real world. Because these what-if games, they don't really matter. That's why I don't engage in them. I don't care what if, I care what is. Come back when you can prove that any of your claims are defensibly true. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some reality to deal with. I don't have time or interest for your bullshit.
But here's the thing. Philosophers have pointed out that Pascal's wager feels like a gamble with no clear rules.
No clear anything, because it's all just betting with what if. What if you go out in the woods and get attacked by Bigfoot? Okay, prove Bigfoot is real first, then we'll talk. Bears and cougars? Sure, because we can prove those are real. Gods? Yeah, not so much. This is why Pascal's wager is such a complete waste of time, because you have no actual gods worth believing in. You only have childish wishes and dreams. And sorry, but if you're an adult, and you should be an adult, then you shouldn't believe in that crap. You should be better than that. Try some maturity for once. It can help, I promise.
Which God are you betting on? Can you even force belief? And doesn't believing just in case feel kind of shallow?
Those are all good points. Belief is not beholden to the will. You can only believe what you're actually convinced of, and that doesn't guarantee that your beliefs are factually correct. And you can say to me, what if your beliefs are wrong? Sure, good point. But that's why I make sure to put everything that I believe to the test, and I try not to believe things that are not evidentially supportable. In fact, I can't think of anything that I do believe that isn't. Perhaps with the exception of the whole hard solipsism thing, but since everybody else has to do the same thing, and there are no evidential solutions for anyone, we just kind of have to go with that. That's kind of sucks, but it is what it is. That's a limitation on how reality actually works. But anything else, I can support it with evidence. If you can't do that with your beliefs, then you've got problems. Given a choice between the two, I pick my way every single time.
Enter Joseph Butler. In 1736, this 18th century bishop and philosopher offered an upgrade to Pascal's wager.
No, he didn't. Now, I'll let him get to it first because I don't really know what he's getting at, but I'm willing to bet that whatever way he goes, he's going to miss some of the major problems. This kind of reminds me of how William Lane Craig reinvigorated the Kalam cosmological argument. We all know that the original cosmological argument had serious issues, and the Kalam was just an attempt to stop people from asking, well, what created God? Of course, that wasn't the only issue, and Kalam is basically a joke at this point because it still makes a lot of unjustified assertions that simply cannot be shown to be real. So go ahead, show us this upgraded version of Pascal's wager. I'm sure it doesn't stand up to any intellectual scrutiny whatsoever, but hey, what do I know, right?
Instead of playing theological roulette, Butler says, take Christianity seriously.
Why? Because there's no good reason to think that Christianity is true. You could say the same thing as a Hindu and say, well, take Hinduism seriously. But that doesn't solve the problem, does it? Just because you've got a belief system that you really, really like, that doesn't make it true. And it's the truth that matters. Until you find a way to prove that Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever else is actually true, then there is no reason to take any of it seriously at all. You can't just say, I like that one, and not make a fool of yourself. But hey, I did break in pretty early there, so go ahead and continue, and we'll see if it gets any better.
Investigate it carefully with an open mind.
Now, I'm good with that, but how many Christians do you know who ever do that? And, remain Christians. I just don't see that, and I sure the hell don't see Testify doing that at all. In fact, people have pointed out flaws in his theology, and he just ignores it and keeps spouting the same nonsense over and over again. Because that's the thing. If you're going to take your beliefs seriously and do your own research, you actually have to take your findings seriously too. Because when you find a flaw, you have to change your theology. You can't just say, it's fine, and then rationalize your way back to where you started, and that's all the religious ever do, right? So this is all just bullshit. That's not how these people work. Try leading by example. When are you going to stop believing all the unsupported nonsense in your head? I'm predicting never. How about you?
Here's his reasoning. For probable proofs, being added not only increase the evidence but multiply it. A mistake in rejecting Christianity could have far more serious consequences than a mistake in accepting it.
But that's just the same thing as before, right? Because if you substitute any other religion, you're right back to square one. In fact, given that there is no evidence that any religion is actually true, the only rational position you can take is saying, I don't know, and get on about your day. If you're so fixated on, what if I'm wrong? Well, what if you're wrong about any of them? You can't just live your life in fear, which is really all religion is. It's being terrified of an undemonstrated imaginary man in the sky that the religion tells you is going to torture you for all eternity if you don't do what they say. Well, how do they know that? That's the question nobody wants to ask. How does the religion know any of the things that they purport to know? Why are you believing these people when they can't prove that they know anything at all? I mean, duh. But the religious aren't that bright, are they?
In other words, Butler's wager isn't about forcing belief, it's about asking whether rejecting Christianity is the bigger risk.
Which is all Pascal's wager was really all about. So he hasn't changed anything, has he? He hasn't done away with all the problems. Because the problem has never been, holy shit, what if I'm wrong? It's, why are you wasting your time with any of this in the first place? If your entire worldview is based on fear, you're fucked up. Do something about it. Stop making a fool of yourself. Learn to deal with reality. It's honestly not that hard.
Let's dig in a little bit. Pascal's wager has some obvious issues, and Butler's wager fixes them.
It does nothing remotely of the sort. Name one thing that it actually solves in any realistic way. Granted, I've got no idea what he's going to say next, but I'm sure he's going to just dance his way around it because that's all he ever does. We've got experience here, remember? The religious are kings of rationalizations, but paupers at actually being rational. They don't know what that word means. So let's get back to it and hopefully he'll explain, although I think we understand that actual explanations will not be forthcoming. He just really wants to believe.
First, there's the many gods objection. Pascal assumes that you're betting on the Christian God, but critics argue there are countless other options,
including potential gods that man has never even dreamed up before. Because remember, there are a near infinite number of potential gods that could be out there somewhere if you want to let your imagination go wild. How does one separate the number of potential gods from the one that might actually be there, if in fact there is a real one at all? The goal here has to be reality, not emotional comfort. And the goal for the religious is always emotional comfort, not reality. I want to know what is actually going on, not what appeals to me on an emotional level. I don't care about the emotions, not one bit. If you're falling out of an airplane without a parachute, it might be really emotionally comforting to think that gravity isn't real. But it still is. Your comfort means nothing. Try to grow up. So really, our only goal ought to be figuring out how to prove which, if any of them, are real. And that doesn't seem to be something that the religious are even trying to do, is it? Wonder why.
Zeus, Odin, Vishnu, Allah, you name it.
But it could be anything that you can dream up. It could be something so bizarre that you couldn't dream it up even if you tried. It could be nothing. It could be many. You just don't know. That's why you can't just say, well, pick one that you like. Because that's not reality. Your wishes and your dreams don't matter. We are trying to get to the real world, and pick one doesn't get you there. That's why none of this matters. If we can't find evidence to support the existence of any God, then there's no good reason to believe in any of them. Rent some intellectual integrity. It's not that hard.
What if you're wrong? Butler doesn't ask you to blindly gamble on a deity. Instead, he challenges you to start with Christianity.
Why? Why not start with the Egyptian gods? Why not Zeus or Odin? It doesn't make any sense to start with the pantheon that you already believe in. We start with the evidence. Does the evidence that we have point to any gods being real at all? If the answer is no, and currently that is the answer, then you don't believe in any gods. Lather, rinse, and repeat. The default is no gods because there is no evidence supporting any of them. Just like the default is no magic because we don't have any evidence for magic. We go where the evidence leads. We don't try to lead it around by the nose like the religious do. We're trying to get to the facts, and the facts are only determined by the evidence. Stop being an idiot. It's really not a good look.
Why? Because it has uniquely strong evidence that sets it apart, and we'll get to that in just a minute.
No, it doesn't. This is you wanting it to be true, not you being able to show that it actually is. If you asked a Hindu, they'd say the same thing. So would a Muslim. So would a believer in Ra or Odin or anything else. If you could find someone to ask at all, that is. This is, again, why he's only making videos for Christians, because they're going to have the same kind of inherent biases that Testify has himself. He just wants it to be true, just like he's assuming that his intended audience does as well. But that doesn't make any of it true, does it? That's why I think it's funny watching two religions argue, because both of them are doing the exact same thing. Obviously, each of them are right. Just ask them. Because this isn't about the independent facts that exist outside of their heads. This is just about what they really want to be true. What you want to be true is irrelevant. Grow the hell up.
Second is the impossibility objection. Pascal's wager makes it sound like belief is a switch that you can just flip.
Wrong.
But belief doesn't work that way. You can't just decide to believe Australia doesn't exist for $1 million.
Which is why you have to remove yourself from the equation, and the religious find it really, really hard to do that. To be fair, a lot of people do. There is stuff that people just want to believe because they've lived with it for a very long time, or it's emotionally comforting, or whatever. That's why you'll find people who believe complete nonsense. But hey, it sounds good to them, right? That doesn't mean anything, though. To someone living in the Middle Ages, disease coming from bad air or being cured by bloodletting, well, that sounded good to them too, but it was still wrong. To people in the ancient world thinking that the world was flat, that sounded good based on what they knew at the time. They were just wrong. The earth is not flat. I know, spoiler alert. But there are people out there who just can't accept that because they desperately want it to be true. If you're after the actual truth, at least as far as we can currently know it, you have to be willing to set it all aside. And a lot of people, the religious specifically in this discussion, the majority of them that I have ever met, they simply can't. And that's a problem.
Butler gets it. He's not asking you to force belief. He's asking you to carefully investigate.
No, he's not. Not at all. You don't carefully investigate by starting with something that you already believe to be true. You start with reality, the only thing that we actually have that we can reasonably say exists. Then you look at reality to see which conclusions, if any, it supports. That is the last thing that Butler or Testify wants you to do. They want you to maintain your faith, and doing it in a realistic way requires that you completely throw your faith away. Faith is not a reliable path to demonstrable truth, and that's what's called for here, and they want nothing at all to do with that. I'm just trying to be honest here, something that you simply can't expect from an apologist, because these people lie through their teeth for a buck.
Inquiry is voluntary, rational, and evidence-driven.
Except that is not what the religious are doing. Rational inquiry is the antithesis of faith. Now, they don't like that, but you just have to go back to Hebrews 11:1 to see that it's true. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Reality is not what we hope for. Reality is what is. We don't come to rational conclusions based on what we don't see, but on what we do. Our understanding incrementally improves as we learn more about the real world. We don't just get to make stuff up that we really like and hope that one day it'll be justified in reality. That's the stupidest damn thing ever, but that is how religion works. That's why it fails the rational sniff test, and it really needs to go away.
If Christianity isn't true, you won't believe it. But if the evidence convinces you, belief flows naturally.
But the evidence to support that doesn't exist. That's the problem. I get that he said that he has evidence in some massive air quotes, but none of that stands up to any kind of rational scrutiny. It's just more of, well, I really like the idea, so it has to be true. It's all been debunked a million times before, but when he gets there, I guess we're just going to have to make it a million times plus one. The religious can never get themselves out of the way of rational inquiry, which is why they fail. They just really wish it was true. But that doesn't mean that it is.
Third, there's the irrationality objection. Isn't believing for a reward just kind of selfish?
I mean, yes, but that's really why the religious do it, isn't it? Faith is based on fear and wishful thinking, not demonstrable fact. It's what they really want to be true, but your wants and your desires don't matter when it comes to the actual facts. They are afraid of death, which is why they dreamed up an afterlife. There's no evidence for any afterlife. In fact, it's utterly absurd based on the evidence that we do have, but that doesn't stop them from believing it because they just want it to be true. This is where they have problems and why they can't get it through their heads that their beliefs are just complete bunk. The time to believe a thing is once you have evidence that that thing is actually true, not believing just in case we ever find any. That's where the religious methodology is completely irrational. Not that they care.
Critics of Pascal's wager argue that belief should be based on evidence, not self-interest. Butler's wager aligns perfectly with evidentialism.
It does nothing at all of the sort. It's just basic Pascal's wager restated in an attempt to get rid of the criticisms while ignoring the overwhelming majority of the criticisms because they just can't get around them. You know, just like the Kalam did. Well, we don't like you criticizing us, so we're just going to make up some stuff, state it confidently, and pretend it's true. Yeah, but that doesn't help, does it? The time to believe anything is when you've got the evidence to back it up, and not one instant before. But they can't manage that, can they? And that's really kind of sad.
It's not about believing for the reward. It's about carefully weighing up the evidence and following it where it leads.
Except it's nothing remotely of the sort for the religious. When you start with the evidence, you never get to the faith. And that's something they can never admit to. It's something they want no part of. You don't say, well, I'll believe this until you prove me wrong. And let's be honest, even when proven wrong, they're not going to change their minds because they were never using them in the first place. It's believing because you really like the idea. And that is positively stupid, yet that's all the religious can do, isn't it? This is where we're going to stop for the day because this is going to get really long otherwise. I figured this would be a single video. I do that a lot, if you notice. But there was just so much concentrated stupid that I just had to stop every couple of seconds and debunk his idiocy. So what do you think so far? Does any of this make sense? Why or why not? Let me know down in the comments. He said we'll get to actual evidence for Christianity, so we'll hopefully get to some in the next video, but none of it's going to be impressive because it never is it? It's all been debunked before, not that he cares. He just really wants to believe. So thanks again to PitchBlack0000 for finding the video. I don't tend to pay a lot of attention to Testify because he makes these garbage videos aimed at the gullibly delusional, but hey, this was actually kind of fun. We'll pick it up again next week and see what his supposed evidence is like. It won't be good, it never is, but hey, that could be fun too. So tune in next week and we'll see. The religious constantly make fools of themselves because they're so desperate to believe whatever load of mythological slop that they've had shoved into their heads from a young age. They lack the ability to take themselves and their emotions out of it and just look at the data involved. That's a them problem, isn't it? And here comes another example. So we're going back to Eric Manning's Testify channel for his Forget Pascal's Wager, here's the real challenge video to finish it up. One thing you will notice about this, and I figure it'll be clearer in the supercut, is that everything he says is completely self-serving. He's not being honest. He's just trying to frame it like his beliefs are right because he really wants them to be right. But that's simply not true. That is not how any of this works. So let's get back to it.
So why investigate Christianity and not, say, Islam or Buddhism? Fair question.
I think you need to investigate all of them, and in fact, I have, at least as many as you can rationally get to in the lifetime that you've got. The problem with the religious is that they don't do that by and large, and they just really stick to the one that they've been indoctrinated into from birth, or that religion that is most common in their culture, and when they find something that appeals to them in that religion, then that's the one that they go with, at least most of the time. That is not a rational way to come to an intelligent conclusion on the truth. Of course, they're not really looking for the truth, are they? They're looking for emotional comfort, whereas I am looking for the truth. Capital T truth, the thing that is most in line with what reality shows us is really going on. But hey, I can't jump on him this early, can I? So let's get back and see where this goes.
But Christianity makes bold historical claims, none bigger than the resurrection of Jesus.
There's really two ways to look at this. First, a lot of them do make bold historical claims. Buddhism claims that Gautama Buddha could walk on water, walk through walls, levitate, become invisible, and make multiple copies of himself. Hinduism makes claims of reincarnation and vast cosmic cycles of creation, preservation, and destruction. I could go on and on and on and on. What he means is that he's personally attached to the Christian ideas and not so much to the others. We find that a lot. Because I once saw a discussion between a Christian and a Hindu, and the Christian was making claims like this, and the Hindu was completely unimpressed, just like I am. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't mean that anyone else should or will. One guy coming back from the dead? Sure, whatever. In Hinduism, almost everybody comes back from the dead in some fashion or another. Christianity is just a piker.
The resurrection wasn't a whispered legend. It was publicly proclaimed right after Jesus' death in Jerusalem, the very place it happened.
The very place it supposedly happened, right? So what? That doesn't mean that it actually happened at all. Elvis still being alive was publicly proclaimed on the same day that he was buried. That doesn't mean it happened. In both cases, where the claims fall down is the complete and utter lack of objectively verifiable evidence in support of it. Neither side has any, and that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you say? But no, the religious will refuse to admit that because they are emotionally attached to the idea and desperately want it to be true, well, it's just got to be true, right? That doesn't mean that it is. People screaming about some non-event that never happened just isn't impressive. And until Christians can prove that Jesus existed at all, with evidence in support, much less came back from the dead, this is a complete non-starter. Just because you really like the idea, that means nothing at all.
The apostles didn't just preach it, they preached it under hostile scrutiny, risking torture and execution.
That's your story anyhow. You can't show that it actually happened or anything, but that's your story. This is really where religion goes so wrong, because they can only make claims. They can never offer any corroboratory evidence for those claims ever happening in reality. Because if people had been running around Jerusalem making these claims, surely somebody else would have noticed, right? You'd have found scholars or officials writing at the supposed time, at least, mentioning this. There just isn't. I've mentioned this before, but all of the scholars that they like to bring up that mention stories of Jesus, those are positively dwarfed by the number of historians, philosophers, and the like who were demonstrably alive and working at the time of Jesus and in the place that Jesus supposedly lived, and never mentioned a thing. It's almost like this stuff didn't happen, isn't it? Seneca the Younger, who lived between 4 BCE and 65 CE, he never mentioned Jesus at all. Early Christians couldn't explain that, so they forged letters, supposedly between him and Paul, but no actual interaction ever demonstrably took place. Pliny the Elder lived between 23 and 79 CE. He might be a little late for the at the time mentions, but he never talked about Jesus at all either, nor any of the supposedly miraculous things that Jesus supposedly did. Philo was around from 20 BCE to 50 CE, and he never said a thing about Jesus. He wrote many books about Jewish religion and history, but he somehow forgot to include Jesus. Lucan, 39 to 65 CE, he was too late to be an eyewitness to a real historical Jesus, but he never wrote a word about Jesus at all, even though he wrote about many different historical events and issues and people, and Jesus was certainly not among them. The list goes on and on and on and on. In fact, there are far more authors in the 1st century CE that ignored Jesus than ever wrote about him at all. And the ones that wrote about Jesus, they didn't actually write about Jesus. They wrote about early Christians who were telling them stories about their supposed magical man god. This is completely unimpressive.
People don't willingly suffer and die for something they know is a lie.
But they certainly can for something that they believe is true, but isn't really. Besides, most of what we know about the disciples is just church tradition anyhow. It's stories that people tell each other that is not demonstrably grounded in truth. That's not to say I'm arguing that it didn't happen, only that we can't show objectively that it did. That's the problem, because the religious really want this stuff to be true, but they've got no way whatsoever to back it up objectively. They're not even trying. That's why they cherry-pick the scholars who did mention Jesus while entirely ignoring the ones who didn't. Because that is significant, but they can't bring themselves to be honest about it because they don't really care, do they? And that's kind of sad, right?
Now, compare that to Islam. The Quran denies Muhammad performed miracles.
Warner? You mean like these?
It's time for Animaniacs. No, stop!
Okay, I have no idea what he means, not that it really matters. Because who cares if Muhammad did miracles? That's not the point of Islam. This is just another attempt to make everyone just like he is, which is abjectly stupid. Because if you really think about it, that's all he's really doing, right? Well, my religion is different, so it's just got to be true. But can't any religion say that? Because they're all different to at least some degree. They all share some themes in common, but each of them has their own individual take on things. Otherwise, they wouldn't be different religions, would they? They'd all be the same giant clusterfuck waste of time. Which I guess if you think about it, they really are. So this isn't nearly as impressive as you seem to think that it is. Just saying.
Say, for example, Surah 2950, which says, I am only a clear warner. And the miracle stories in the Hadiths come much later, with zero risk for promoting them.
The same really goes for Christianity, though, doesn't it? It was decades before any of this was ever written down. Mostly it was just a giant game of telephone whispered between disparate churches and believers, not like they were marching down Main Street with a megaphone announcing it for all the world to hear, because that's not what happened. Even if the apostles existed, and for most of them we've got no evidence for that whatsoever, but even if they did, they weren't shouting this stuff from the mountaintops. They were traveling to tiny churches around Palestine and speaking to a few people at a time. Most Christians have a very poor understanding of early church history. What the hell else is new?
Krishna, his miracles like lifting a mountain were written centuries later, blending legend with theology.
Just like Jesus. Maybe not centuries, but certainly decades, and we have no evidence whatsoever that any of it ever happened at all. We know that whoever wrote these stories down, since we have no clue who actually wrote the Gospels, we know they were not eyewitnesses. None of the supernatural events in the Bible have any evidence to back them up. Just because you have early copies, that doesn't mean that it ever happened at all. That's where he's going completely wrong.
Buddha, stories of him taming elephants or walking at birth emerged hundreds of years after his life. Zoroaster, his miracles were recorded millennia later with no hostile witnesses or historical evidence.
I'm just letting him run on because I don't want to have to say the same thing over and over and over again. He's asserting hostile witnesses when he has no demonstrable witnesses to anything. This is just how he's choosing to spin it, but that doesn't mean it happened that way. This is even more religious story time because really, what else can they do? So I'm going to skip over any other examples he might give because they don't mean anything. These things just don't help him out one bit.
Christianity's claims are public, early, and bold.
Not demonstrably at all. Christianity was a mystery religion, and like most mystery religions, they were secret religious groups in the Greco-Roman world that offer special religious experiences to initiates. They were characterized by secrecy and involved initiation rituals, like baptism was in Christianity. It didn't really go public for centuries because Christianity in the first century and beyond, it was illegal. Rome outlawed it because they saw it as idolatry, the refusal to worship the Roman gods and emperor. Early Christians were therefore accused of being atheists, funny that, and traitors to the state. So no, they weren't out there ringing a bell on the street corner and trying to get converts. That would make them all very, very dead.
So, if you're going to investigate one religion, it makes more sense to start here.
No, it makes much more sense to start with the evidence and only bother with religions that can be demonstrated to be factually correct. That leaves pretty much all religions out, doesn't it? It only makes sense to start with something real and not run down the primrose path into La La Land because you really like the idea. This is just stupid, but once again, he's not making this video for us, even though the title is Atheists, Forget Pascal's Wager, Here's the Real Challenge. Because he doesn't actually care about atheists at all. He's just trying to get to the people who might pay him. And that's not atheists. Eric, he's an idiot. We can all see right through this, right? Let me know down in the comments if you don't, because that's kind of pathetic in my opinion.
So, here's how Butler's wager plays out. If Christianity is false, you lose a bit of time.
And your intellectual integrity and a lot of money if you're donating to a church, and your own self-respect. You know, things like that. They love to pretend that you're only wasting your time, but it can be a considerable amount of time to waste. Back when I was a Christian, I was in church more than half the day on Sunday, every Sunday, 2 services, Sunday school, youth group, whatever it was in between, depending on when in my life you're talking about. Plus Wednesday night had a service that I almost never missed. Every major religious holiday. I went to school there. I had religion shoved down my gullet every single day. And then I went to a religious high school and I had the exact same thing happen. So no, it wasn't just a little time. It was a lot of time, at least if you took any of it seriously. Then throw in Bible study and prayer and all the rest of that. I don't know how much time I actually wasted, but it was a lot. Then my parents were throwing a ton of money into the collection plate. I honestly don't know how much since it wasn't me doing it early on. Then there was all the stuff that the church expected you to do, all the work they expected you to provide for free. And I've talked about that before too. This is not an insignificant amount of time, at least not if you take it seriously, which I did. Granted, a lot of Christians don't, But they're ignoring verses like Matthew 6:33, which says, "Seek God's kingdom and righteousness above all else," and Colossians 3:1-3, which says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." So no, it's not an insignificant amount of time. It's the overriding focus of your life.
But you gain a stronger, more informed understanding of one of history's most influential religions.
So what? Influential doesn't mean true. And without truth, all you're doing is wasting your time. Now, I'm going to use an example of why this is pointless by referencing one of my best friends who was once my co-host on the old podcast. He has degrees in history. He can tell you more about what happened in the Roman Empire than he can tell you about what's going on in the world today. Many years in college and tens of thousands of dollars down the drain because it's never made him a red cent in a job. Same thing happened with my wife, who has a degree in cultural anthropology, which is completely useless. There are no jobs in cultural anthropology. Luckily, she had other degrees to fall back on and be successful with, so knowing about this thing that is demonstrably useless and unsupportable that you just so happen to like for emotional reasons, that is completely meaningless. You're just wasting your life. Stop it. Seek help.
You become a credible critic, not just another Reddit atheist recycling bad arguments. And let's be real, even people with YouTube channels or even PhDs behind their name are guilty of being uninformed critics.
No, that's you. Because you're not a critic at all. You're running on pure fifis and faith and figuring that just because you really like the idea, it's just gotta be true. It's just like all the theists who come in here with their limited repertoire and only have empty claims and meaningless arguments and feelings, who sling them around like they actually mean something, and when they get completely debunked, all they can do is throw them around again because they've got nothing else. Why? Because they don't care if any of it is actually true. A rational person, when their arguments get destroyed, they stop making those arguments. But I really like it doesn't matter. Eric Manning doesn't give a shit, and neither do most Christians, because they are emotionally invested, not intellectually justified. You're the ones with the problems. Stop making fools of yourselves.
Now, if Christianity is true, you gain truth, purpose, and eternal life.
If is not because. By the time that you've discovered that it isn't true, you've already wasted your life. Yes, it is your life to waste. If you really want to do that, go ahead, but stop trying to drag everyone else down with you. That is not a good thing. That's why we try to figure out the actual truth now with evidence to back it up so that you don't waste your life in the long term believing any of this bullshit. For people like Eric, though, this is just a scam. Let's be honest, that's all it is.
That's a really big deal. The stakes are high, but the cost of entry is small.
No, it's not, because the stakes really aren't that high, except in your head. That's where all of this resides. You just really like the idea, and because you can make a buck doing it, there is a financial benefit to unwarranted belief, but that doesn't make the cost of entry low. I happen to value my intellectual integrity. I am not going to flush that down the toilet like the religious do for emotional comfort and wishes and dreams. If you want to, I can't stop you. I can only point and laugh because you are just embarrassing yourself. But hey, what else is new, right?
Are you willing to give Christianity a fair shot?
I did. It failed. Are you going to give Buddhism or Hinduism or Scientology a fair shot? I suspect the answer is no. Why? Because he can't make a living off of gullible Hindus or Buddhists or Scientologists living where Eric lives. Preaching the gospel only works where people are receptive to the gospel. Any gospel of sorts from any religion. That's why most of the major Islamic apologists, they all live in the Middle East, don't they? There are a few others here and there, but most of the big names, they're where the majority of Muslims are, so they can be financially supported. So no, I don't think Eric would be willing to put his faith to the test or check out any other religion fairly because it's not beneficial for him to do so. He's made up a lot of empty excuses for why he wouldn't even try. Big surprise there.
You'll know that you've taken Butler's wager when you can present the strongest case for Christianity and explain why you still reject it.
There is no strong case for Christianity, though. This is another problem that the religious tend to have because all of them do it regardless of religion. They have no strong case. They have no evidence. They have bald rationalizations, but nothing that stands up to critical scrutiny. I reject Christianity just like I reject all other religions because they have no demonstrable evidential support. That's what they need to have, and they have none. I reject on the basis of evidence or lack thereof. When you can come back and prove that your beliefs are evidentially justified, then we'll talk. But until then, and especially once you see the blatant dishonesty going on, hard pass. Not because I don't want Christianity to be true, but because there's no good reason to think that it is. It's the evidence that matters, and you've got none.
Now, I've been following the whole apologetics, counter-apologetics movement for over a decade, and I've yet to see this done. Personally, I would love to see skeptics take me up on this challenge.
Anytime. In fact, I just did. 2 videos of it. There you go. Because I don't buy your bullshit, and I've debunked all your claims. Okay, Eric, done and done. I doubt you'll have a response, because that's not how you work. Now, I don't know if anybody else has done this video, because I don't tend to pay a lot of attention outside of the specific channels that I follow, but I'd love to know, especially since at the moment that I'm writing this, it's been out about a month, and I'd like to know if anybody else has gone after him. Not that he cares, because Eric generally just ignores his detractors. In fact, the pinned comment on this video whines about atheist coping because he can't imagine that his entire challenge is just laughable. Lots of people have pointed out just how dumb he is in his comments, and he just goes, "Ha-ha, I'm still right," and just ignores the criticism. Because really, what else can he do?
And I can guarantee you that the people that will be most offended at this video are the people who could stand to take the challenge the most.
And he's projecting. What else is new? Because we point this out a lot, right? Not only all the places that they're demonstrably wrong or lack corroboratory support for their claims, but that they are clinging desperately to their own beliefs based only on fifis and faith, and lashing out at anyone else who disagrees, or worse, points out their ridiculous failures. But I'm not wrong. Sure you are. You wanting to be right doesn't mean you're right. You feeling all warm and fuzzy inside doesn't make you right. Only the evidence makes you right, and they're so busy assuming that because they've been indoctrinated into this, often by people they respect, that it just has to be right because nobody would lie to them, right? Except lots of people will, or at the very least, just because others believe it too, that doesn't make it true. They are on a search for comfort, and I only care for truth. Eric doesn't give a damn, which is why he's pandering to others who are also only out after comfort and ignoring everybody like me who points out all of his ridiculous failures. This is not a surprise. This is insanely common, and not just Eric is guilty. Virtually all apologists are, because they're after comfort and a fat bank account. Because according to an online monetization checker, Testify brings in plenty of money every single year. It's hard to get meaningful data because YouTube has tried to obscure it, but he's still making bank, making videos, claiming things that aren't true. Not that that's a bad thing, trust me, I love making money, but I don't flush my intellectual integrity down the crapper to do it. I don't lie to people. If someone were to prove me wrong with evidence to back it up, I would change my mind, and I'd stop saying the thing that I was wrong about. I don't think you can say that about most apologists. They don't care if what they're saying is true. They just want to believe and make a buck. And that's kind of pathetic.